Hello and welcome to this episode of Military History Inside Out, presented by War Scholar. Today I speak with Phil Porter, who is director of Mackinaw State Historic Parks. I think I have that right. I mentioned his title again during the episode. So we talk about his book, which is a collection of images associated with soldiers who served at Fort Mackinac in northern Michigan, and that covers all the way from 18th to the 19th century. It includes British and American soldiers because both were present at the fort at different times. We talk about sort of daily garrison life, what conditions were like for soldiers through that whole period. We talk about the histories of some of the soldiers who served there and what they went on to do. Some very well-known persons as far as the Civil War, interesting stuff on the War of 1812. So definitely cool stuff about U.S. forts, about U.S. The history of U.S. soldiers and the U.S. Army, slice of life kind of stuff. So thank you and enjoy. I'm speaking with Phil Porter, director of Mackinaw State Historic Parks, about his book, The Soldiers of Fort Mackinac, An Illustrated History. Thank you for speaking with me.
My pleasure, Chris.
So tell me first, how did you get into studying and writing about this subject?
Well, I started work at Fort Mackinac as a tour guide in 1972, so 46 years ago, while I was doing my undergraduate studies at Kenyon College in Ohio, majoring in history, and I knew that at the time I wanted to do something in the history field. Wasn't too keen on the idea of teaching, and when I began working at this historic site, I thought, boy, this would be the way in which I would like to apply my interest in history with a professional career. So I continued to work here throughout my undergraduate studies, and then I went to the State University of New York, College of Oneonta, Cooperstown Graduate Program of History Museum Studies, and received my master's degree there, and then was able and fortunate enough to come back and began working full-time for Mackinaw State Historic Parks at Fort Mackinac and our other historic sites that are within our parks.
Okay, and I saw that you had written another book about the Mackinac Parks.
I've actually written several books, and they've all been about Mackinac. I've written two other books that relate to military history. The first one I wrote was called The Eagle at Mackinac, and it was about the establishment of United States military and civil authority here after the American Revolutionary War. It began after the Jay Treaty in 1796. Troops got here for the first time that year in 1796, and American troops did. And it's about that first chapter in American military history at Fort Mackinac. Then several years later, I wrote a book called Undesirable Station, which is a study about soldier life at Fort Mackinac from 1867 to 1895 when the fort closed. That's really the last chapter in American military occupation of Fort Mackinac. It's about the post-Civil War Army and its occupation of Fort Mackinac, and really dominated by the fact that Mackinac Island became a national park in 1875, and the soldiers and the fort got a new life here at Fort Mackinac by becoming the caretakers of the national park. When the Army decided to remove the military from the fort in 1895, that national park became a state park, and the celebration of the site began immediately after its abandonment by the Army. Desirable Station was again the second book that I wrote, and it began to focus more and more on soldier life at the fort, and that's where Soldiers at Fort Mackinac really picks up an illustrated history. This is the most recent book that I published in conjunction with our organization and Michigan State University, and there's an introductory essay that talks about the evolving role of soldiers at the fort. Again, Fort Mackinac was a military outpost from the American Revolution from 1780 until 1895, and the purpose and function of the fort changed dramatically over the years, and there were more than 4,000 soldiers that served here. So I do an introductory essay about the changing role of military purpose and life for soldiers at the fort, and then it's illustrated by the images that we have of the soldiers who served here. There's only about 150 that we've collected, all the way from early oil portraits of British officers through photographs, late 19th century photographs of American soldiers that served here.
So now I guess I was going to ask about the book, and I guess we've segued into that. Is the book, is it just a book of illustrations, or do you go into a narrative, or tell me about the book?
Yeah, sure. There's a substantial narrative at the beginning. I call it an introductory essay, and again, it's the purpose of that, the overall purpose of the book is to talk about the evolving role of soldiers at the fort. And in that introductory essay, that's precisely what I try to do, is draw out the story of why soldiers were stationed here, first by the British during the Revolution, all the way through 1895, and how the fort evolved over time from being a very important post on the border with Canada, protecting American interests, protecting American fur trade, and here to develop and sustain relations with the Native Americans in the early years. And then it went through a period in the mid-19th century where it was a fairly obsolete backwater post. It frankly was a place where they stored soldiers when they weren't needed elsewhere. And so it was abandoned several times during the Second and Third Seminole Wars, during the Mexican-American War, during the American Civil War. And then again, it got new life beginning in 1875 with the creation of Mackinaw National Park. They doubled the size of the garrison, made the commanding officer the superintendent of the park, and the soldiers, in essence, became his rangers. And so they had what wasn't a very military duty, but it was an important national responsibility of caring for the park.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think the book it's close to 200 pages. Is that correct?
It is. Yeah, it's over 200 pages.
So now is it dominated by the illustrations then, with descriptions, or?
Yeah, that's correct. After the introductory essay, it is there's a single image that I have of a soldier that served at Fort, with a short biography of that soldier, especially with respect to that soldier's service at Fort Mackinac.
Mm-hmm. So how did you basically use every image you could find of soldiers at Fort Mackinac, or was it selected? And
every single one that I could find and get permission to use, and so that meant almost all of them.
Mm-hmm.
Our organization has been active in the collection of historic images really since 1958. So it was really building on the work of many of my predecessors who had collected a number of images. But then when I began to do the book, I did a fairly substantial internet search and searching in other areas to find any image that I could find to put in the book, and was able, by the end of the effort, to get about 150 different images.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell me about some of the more significant images that you found, and what they mean, what they represent?
Sure. The book begins with the first image is the gentleman who was responsible for building the fort. His name was Lieutenant Governor Patrick Sinclair. He was the Lieutenant Governor of the British area up here. He was also the commander of the fort. His name was Patrick Sinclair. And all we have of him is a silhouette of him later in life, but that's what we use as an image. But it was Patrick Sinclair who made the decision to build the fort. And really, Fort Mackinaw on Mackinaw Island, is the same fort that used to be Fort Michilimackinac, which was on the mainland about 8 miles away from here. That fort was built originally by the French in 1715, taken over by the British after the conquest of New France. It became British Canada. And then in 1780, it was Sinclair that made the decision to move to that because it was during the Revolution, and Michilimackinac was low and close to the water and not particularly defensible. By moving to the island, he built it on the high limestone bluffs that we have here on the island. It gave it a much more defensible location. So he's the first image that I have in the book, and then we have a few of the British officers that were here, and then we move into the American period. I will say that one of the more interesting early British officers that we have was one during the War of 1812, because during the war, in fact, at the very beginning of the War of 1812, the American fort here was captured by British soldiers and occupied by the British government during the course of the War of 1812. Mm-hmm. In 1814, as the war was going on, American troops tried to recapture the fort, and it was very successfully defended by Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDowell. And I have an image of McDowell in the book. McDowell was a native of Stranraer, Scotland, and I was able, through the small little museum in Stranraer, to find an image of him just a few years ago. And so we've incorporated that in the book. He's significant not only because he really brilliantly defended the island and the fort during the attack, but he also was responsible for for finishing construction of a second post on the island, sort of a small outpost, a redoubt that protected Fort Mackinac, originally named Fort George in honor of George III, later renamed Fort Holmes in honor of an American officer who was slain during that battle in 1814.
Mm-hmm. So let me interrupt you for a moment here. When I was looking at a map of the area, trying to figure out why the fort was positioned where it was. I guess there are 3 islands there, and I was trying to see which passages, between the 2 Great Lakes, and then there's the other passage further north. I was trying to figure out why that location, what purpose did it serve in that area?
Keeping in mind that all of the travel at that time throughout this vast region is on the water, and the waterways narrow at the Straits of Mackinac, where Lakes Huron and Michigan connect, and so any traffic flowing through here has to come through this narrow straits. And so if you have a military presence here, by virtue of that, you have military control.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that's flowing through, the main thing that's flowing through the area at that time, is the business of the fur trade, which is a huge industry. It is the industry of the Upper Great Lakes for almost 200 years. And so by having a military presence here, you're able to control the trade with respect to the government licensing of traders, but you're also able to protect traders and, probably more importantly, maintain effective relations with the Native Americans, who are always in this early area the dominant population, primarily Odawa and Ojibwe people. And by having a presence here, you're able to develop those relationships and keep them as allies in support of your interests, rather than whomever else might be trying to take control of your interests.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like it was more a fortified sort of government presence position, rather than keeping anyone you didn't want to going through the straits, I guess. I'm not sure what.
That's correct. It is a strait, and you're correct. You could not, with the cannon of Fort Mackinac, totally dominate the straits. It's about 8 miles wide.
Mm-hmm.
However, by having a military presence here, you would have the resources to control those waterways, even though you couldn't from the fort itself. So you're right. It's a governmental presence to again, control the fur trade and maintain those relations with Native Americans, but it also gave you a military presence that gave you the best opportunity to have military control as well.
And forgive me if you mentioned this already, but the other 2 islands that are there, why not use those? They seemed larger and maybe more resources.
The island just in front of us here is called Round Island. It's very small, much smaller than Mackinac. The much larger island that you're referring to is Bois Blanc or Bablo Island.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for Mackinac is that it is blessed with very high limestone bluffs, unlike the other 2 islands.
Mm-hmm.
So by positioning the fort here on the bluff, it gave it better natural protection. And the second thing that Mackinac Island has is a very fine, deep natural harbor.
Mm-hmm.
So the combination of those 2 natural elements made Mackinac the desirable location for the outpost.
In the mainland area, just the land on either side of the straits, was that of any use militarily, or?
Well, there had been forts at both those locations. The south side of the straits is where Fort Michilimackinac, basically the predecessor of this fort, was. But again, it's very low, close to the water, not much of a natural harbor. Coming to the island provided a much more defensible location. And really the same could be said about the north side of the Straits of Mackinac, the mainland. Again, that's now St. Ignace, Michigan. It does have a nice harbor, but it is not as defensible a location as Mackinac Island.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I guess it's not too isolated. Being on an island, you could get the supplies you need, water, food, whatnot.
Yeah, keeping in mind that the travels on the water, it was not isolated at all. In fact, many items that would otherwise be produced by local tradesmen were actually imported here because it was on the trade route. It was the center of the trade route.
Mm-hmm.
Today it's a little more isolated because we travel by cars and planes and trains and all that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But back then it was right in the middle of the water highway system, like a rest stop on the turnpike.
So even in bad, cold weather, it was still, I guess the waters were still navigable and...
No. When you come to the winter, it now speaks to the seasonal nature of the place. Mackinac has always been a summer place. So when the fur trade is the dominant industry and tons and millions of dollars worth of furs are flowing through here, because this was a summer transshipment point, it is a summer activity. When winter comes, it is a very quiet, place. Back then it was extremely desolate, and the ice would, or the water would oftentimes freeze. People would cross on the ice, but it basically went into hibernation until the following season, when that industry began up again.
Mm-hmm. So to get back to the military people who were on the fort, I get, it sounds like it was mostly Army, but did they have many? Did sailors hang out there, or how much of a presence? Since it's all waterways around there.
No, that's an interesting point. There was never a naval presence, other than upon occasion there was a naval officer here with perhaps a few sailors to support a small, very small fleet. But for the most part, it was almost always Army, especially in the American period. There were never naval officers here, mm-hmm. So there was really not much of a naval presence.
Okay. All right. So I feel like I interrupted your flow with the images.
No, that's good.
Can you talk then? Yeah, I guess go ahead and continue with the other images that are special.
Sure. Obviously I can't talk about all 150, but I'll talk about a couple of the other major officers that were here. Again, after the Jay Treaty was signed, which was a land treaty that resolved some of the differences that still remained after the American Revolutionary War, American troops finally took control of Fort Mackinac following the Revolution, and that was in 1796. And those first troops were under the command of Major Henry Burbeck. He was a American Revolutionary War artillery officer, and he commanded the first American troops that came here in 96. The following year, in 1796, additional troops came, but with them came James Wilkinson, who at that time was the commanding officer of the entire United States Army. Not a very big army, but he was the commanding officer, and it's the only time that the commanding officer of the Army ever came to Fort Mackinac. And he came with a specific purpose of deciding what to do with the fort, because the British, knowing that they were going to have to transfer to the Americans for a long time, let it go. So when the United States Army got here in the late 1790s, it was in disrepair, and the question was what to do with it. Was abandon it, enlarge it, contract it? And it was Wilkinson, along with Burbeck and Moses Porter, another artillery officer, who made the decision to reconfigure the fort and add blockhouses at the corners of the fort to provide the primary defensive units of the fort. And it is that configuration that still exists today. In fact, I'm sitting out behind the fort as I speak to you, looking at the back wall of the fort, and that is the back wall that was established as the rear wall of the fort in 1796 by Burbeck and Porter, and again, General Wilkinson.
Okay.
There are a number of images, again, in the pre-war of 1812 period. One of the more interesting ones to me is the first medical officer, United States medical officer that was assigned to the fort. His name was Dr. Francis LeBaron. Mm-hmm. He began his medical military career as a surgeon's mate in the Navy in 1800, but 2 years later transferred to the Army, and soon after became the first in a long line of U.S. medical officers to serve at Fort Mackinac. And during his tenure, as officers often did, they dabbled in other businesses, in the side businesses. And one of the things that he did was he created a distillery on the island. And that distillery had an important role at the beginning of the War of 1812, a few years later. Mm-hmm. So when the war breaks out, the Americans are in control of the fort, and the British decide to capture it, again, because it's so strategically important. And so there is a small British fort in Canadian waters about 40 miles from here called Fort St. Joseph. And during the night of July 16th, 1812, they sail to the island, to the back of the island, and they arrive on the island, and they have captured a couple of American civilians. And they're prepared to attack the fort, but they don't want the village to be, or the village inhabitants to be injured. And so they send an envoy down to the village at night, and they take all of the civilians and move them into that distillery that LeBaron had built, and then send word to the fort that they are prepared to attack. And the Americans very quickly decide to surrender because the British Army is well positioned behind the fort with cannon, with regular troops, with militia, and about 500 native allies. Mm-hmm. And inside the fort, there's about 57 American soldiers. So it wouldn't have been much of a battle, and I think quite wisely, the American commander decided to surrender. And so again, during the war, the British stayed here. At the end of the war, the Treaty of Ghent returned the property to the United States, And in 1815, U.S. soldiers came back and again stayed here all the way until 1895.
Mm-hmm. Now, did the soldiers of that time have different uniforms or equipment compared to, say, soldiers out, on the eastern Atlantic seaboard, because of the weather or conditions or anything?
That's a really good question. I think that the regularity of the uniforms is much more consistent as you move throughout the 19th century. The soldiers here certainly had, at some point, the uniform of the Army, but shipping it from Washington or wherever the contractor was making uniforms was a rather long process, and so our suspicion has always been that there was some lag time in getting the uniforms here, but essentially they had the same uniforms as the regular Army. In some cases, they made adaptations because of the weather. Oftentimes, we have records of the British Army converting blankets into coats, and that was simply to put up with the very brutal winters that we have here in northern Michigan.
Mm-hmm. And having been at in the center of this fur trade, was any of the fur modified for by soldiers in any way?
No, they were much too valuable. they were shipped here from the west where they'd been traded and gathered here and then shipped to the east in the large canoes. And I don't think hardly any of the furs ever stayed here. They were a very, very valuable commodity, and so they were moved east and eventually to European markets where they were made into garments.
Because the volume of fur was still pretty high.
Yeah, it was exceptionally high. So after the war of 1812, John Jacob Astor establishes the Northern Department headquarters of the American Fur Company on Mackinaw Island. It is the most lucrative of his various departments. And by the 1820s, millions of dollars worth of furs are flowing through Mackinaw on their way to New York now before they go to European markets. And really, the furs from Mackinaw helped to make Astor this country's first millionaire. So that gives you some sense of the size and the importance of the fur industry, and especially Mackinaw's role in it.
Mm-hmm. So even if the soldiers were to happen to kill their own game, say, or something like that, they wouldn't use the fur to for moccasins or lining or anything like that? Not
really. No, they probably didn't do much hunting other than for game sport. Officers would, not so much the enlisted men, because they were receiving from Detroit through U.S. contracts the rations that were supplied by the Army. So for the most part, they were eating the traditional Army rations of the period. Very little game hunting at that time. In the earlier periods, under the British and certainly under the French, when they were at Michilimackinac, there was some fishing going on because the Straits of Mackinac was and still is renowned for its whitefish and lake trout. But really, by the time Americans are here, even during the War of 1812 period, they're mostly depending on the rations being provided by the government.
Okay. I think I read a story about, I forget what year this was, but a doctor who happened to have a patient with a hole in his stomach.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, we're sort of moving along chronologically, and I have in my book a portrait of Dr. William Beaumont and his family. Dr. Beaumont was the post surgeon at Fort Mackinac from 1820 to 1825. And in 1822, there was a young French-Canadian voyageur named Alexis St. Martin who was in the town below the fort doing business when he was accidentally shot with a fowling piece. It was like a shotgun blast into his abdomen. And Dr. Beaumont, being the only physician on the island, treated him and left him actually in the building in the back room. He thought to die because it was such a traumatic wound. The next day he was alive, and the doctor brought him up to the fort and into the officer's stone quarters where he lived, and the building still stands in the fort today. And there he began a long series of operations to close the wound and save his life. And he got it half right. He saved his life, but there developed what physicians call a gastric fistula, where there remained a permanent hole into his stomach. It was healed, but Dr. Beaumont could put his finger in the hole, push back the stomach lining, and be looking right into what was a healthy human stomach. Beaumont, being an inquisitive and brilliant physician, decided that this was a great opportunity to do direct experimentation on the stomach and figure out the mystery of human digestion. And so he did a number of experiments over a period of about 11 years, published a book in 1833, and it was really the first time that physicians understood some of the basics of digestion. And he had isolated hydrochloric boric acid as the primary substance that broke down food in the process of digestion.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is that, this story and Beaumont's experiments are still taught in medical schools today.
So the poor patient, how was he compensated, or?
The poor patient was somewhat compensated. Beaumont sometimes had a difficulty in keeping him around for experiments, because this is a young guy who's a proud voyageur. He doesn't want to be a guinea pig, and so he goes back to his job of being a voyageur, a paddleman for the canoes.
Mm-hmm.
Beaumont lures him back with gifts of money, and they have an on and off relationship over a number of years.
Mm-hmm.
But he was at times a very reluctant patient, but willing to come back when the price was right. And certainly Beaumont was motivated to continue to learn through this very unique individual.
I guess the doctor could always say, "Hey, I saved your life, so you owe me. Come on back."
Yeah, right.
Okay, so please continue on then chronologically with the images.
Yeah, there's just a number of images. I have one of Lieutenant Edwin Vose Sumner. He had a very short and unhappy stay at Fort Mackinac. He came here and immediately got into something of a confrontation with one of the medical officers that ended up being kind of physical. So he was court-martialed and discharged for 6 months. Returned to the Army, was assigned to the Dragoons, and fought in the Mexican-American War. And it was during the Battle of Cerro Gordo in April of 1847 that he gained the name Bullhead when a musket ball, probably a spent musket ball, bounced off his head during the battle. But Edwin Vose Sumner, like many of the pre-Civil War officers, went on to serve in the Civil War, and he was ultimately promoted to Major General of the Volunteers during the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the most notorious soldier that served at Fort Mackinac was a Lieutenant Ephraim Kirby Smith. He had a better-known brother known as under the name of Edmund Kirby Smith, but Ephraim graduated last in his class from the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1826.
Mm-hmm.
Fort Mackinac was his second assignment, and he soon gathered a reputation for being a fairly brutal officer. He would take soldiers that he was convinced were guilty of some breach of military conduct into his private quarters, and he would summarily punish them. He had a cat of nine tails or a leather whip that he would use, and that went on for a long period of time. So we come to Christmas Day in 1829, and the commanding officer suspends duty for the day, as they often did, gave the soldiers an extra ration of whiskey. One of them was misbehaving, and so Smith took him into his quarters and started whipping him.
Mm-hmm.
His fellow soldiers in the soldiers' barracks across the parade ground are drinking and getting madder and madder and drinking more. And all of a sudden they mount bayonets and they start charging across the parade ground. They're going to go rescue their friend. Smith sees them coming through the window in his quarters, draws his sword out in the parade ground, and a small battle ensues before the guards separate them all.
Mm-hmm.
His sword is broken, he's slightly wounded, and 8 men are arrested in what is known as the Christmas Day Mutiny of Fort Mackinac. Those 8 men were all court-martialed and incarcerated and eventually honorably discharged from the military.
Mm-hmm.
But Smith also was court-martialed under a general court-martial, and he too was removed from the Army because of his long pattern of improper misconduct in really beating these soldiers in his quarters.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, President Andrew Jackson restores his commission in the Army. I'm not quite sure why. It probably had to do with the exchange of some favors or money or whatever, because he didn't deserve to be in the Army, but he came back, eventually fought in the Battle of Molino del Rey in the Mexican-American War, where he was wounded, and eventually he died of those wounds. And I've often wondered exactly who fired the shot that wounded him. Was it his own soldiers, or was it the enemy? He was not a particularly popular officer, at least while he was at Fort Mackinac.
So, was there much in the way of conflict, violent conflict with the Native Americans in the area, or were they just gently removed over time?
No, only during the War of 1812, when in both cases, both during the British attack and capture of the fort and the British defense of the fort in 1814, in both cases there was significant Native allies from 5 different tribes in support of the British cause. And so the only real conflict between American soldiers and Native Americans was during that battle on Mackinaw Island in 1814, when the British successfully defended the fort, and it was a fairly quick and decisive British victory. About 13 Americans were killed during that, and most of those were killed in a side skirmish between Native Americans and British soldiers. So that's the only time there was real conflict between Native Americans and British soldiers.
So did the fort ever employ Native American scouts, or were there any Native Americans in uniform for the U.S. there?
Not that I know of. There were at times, especially in the British period, there were militia. There was a Mackinaw militia for a short period of time around the War of 1812, and that undoubtedly had people who were at least part native because they would have been locals who may have been Métis people of mixed blood of French or British and Native American blood.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, the Civil War. I saw the story about the 3 Confederate sympathizers, I guess, that were held there.
Yes.
Do you have any pictures related to the Civil War?
We do have pictures. We have multiple images of officers who served in the Civil War and during their Civil War service, but had previously served at Fort Mackinac. And some of whom, there were 7 actually, who had served at Fort Mackinac under in the U.S. Army, that when the Civil War was declared, they resigned their commission and joined the Confederacy. Probably the most notable of all of those, there's several, and many of them raised to fairly high ranks because they're well-trained officers for the South. Probably the most notable one of the group would have been he was lieutenant at Fort Mackinac, John Pemberton. Pemberton was a West Point graduate. He served at Fort Mackinac. He was from Pennsylvania, but he married a woman named Martha Thompson, who was the daughter of a Virginia plantation owner. And so he made the decision to join the Confederacy, I'm sure in support of her family. And he was commissioned in the Confederate Army and rose fairly quickly to the rank of lieutenant general. And it was Pemberton who was in command of the Confederate Army at Vicksburg, and when it was defeated by Grant. It was a decisive Union victory, as I'm sure you probably know. It reopened the Mississippi River to Union occupation. It divided the Confederate Army east of the Mississippi and west of the Mississippi, and it burnished the reputation of Grant, who then, as we know, ultimately went on to serve in command of the East. But it also ruined the reputation of Pemberton, who had always been under some suspicion by his other Confederate officers because he was from Pennsylvania. But he was reduced in rank and eventually sort of fell into anonymity during the rest of his service during the war.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
John Marshall Jones also served at Fort Mackinac. He too went on. He was a native of Virginia, and he went on to resign his commission and was immediately commissioned into the Confederate States Army, and he rose to the rank of brigadier general. Jones was killed in action during the Battle of the Wilderness just 6 months later. And again, in my book, there's multiple other stories about both Union and Confederate officers who had served at Fort Mackinac prior to the war, and who saw significant service in the Civil War. One of the more notable ones was actually a medical officer, and that was, I need to turn to his page here, that was Dr. William Alexander Hammond. Hammond was the medical officer at the fort just prior to the Civil War. He actually resigned his commission, went into private practice, but the Civil War breaks out. He's appointed into the medical corps, and he eventually becomes the Surgeon General. He is the top-ranking medical officer in the entire Union Army, and responsible for transforming the medical department from a small peacetime establishment into a vast army serving over 500,000 soldiers.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the book, are there any images that would really surprise a reader or jump out, like, or just odd or strange in some way?
I don't know if they're so strange. Some of the stories are kind of interesting. There was a Lieutenant Phelps who had served here before the war, and Phelps eventually also served in the Union Army during the Civil War, but he resigned his commission in 1862 because in 1862 the Union Army still was not utilizing African American soldiers, and he was an avid abolitionist and thought that they should be able to fight. It wasn't until the following year that the Union Army began to use African American soldiers. But he remained out of the Army and home in Brattleboro, Vermont, and became very active in politics. And Phelps eventually ran for president of the United States. He's the only soldier from Fort Mackinac that we know that ever ran for the presidency of the United States. He ran the anti-Masonic American Party ticket, and he received 707 votes. So it was interesting story, but not much of a politician.
So when I ask about the images, I guess I would also include any that perhaps the colors or style, or because I guess it's both painted or drawn and photographs as well, right?
Yes, we have. What was particularly thrilling to me was to find some of the oil portraits of early officers that we had never collected before, and adding those to the collection, images to our collection, and having them in the book was really nice, because it does add color to the book, and they're beautiful images. One of which is of a young lieutenant who served here. His name was Presley Neville O'Bannon. He really wasn't so well known as an Army officer, but he served in the Marines, and he distinguished himself in the Tripoli campaign during the First Barbary War in the early 1800s, and he became the first man to raise the U.S. flag over foreign soil in the time of war during the Battle of Derna in 1805, and that the Marine Corps song from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. The shores of Tripoli refers to his involvement and the Marine involvement in that First Barbary War. So he did serve at Fort Mackinac briefly. After he resigned his commission in the Marines, he was here at Fort Mackinac between 1807 and 1808. Getting back to the Civil War, you had mentioned about Confederate soldiers being stationed here. So the war breaks out, and there's a single company of American artillerists here, and they were immediately reassigned. I think the war was declared in April of 1861, and within a couple of months, the artillery company is removed from Fort Mackinac and sent directly to Washington in the defense of the capital, because it's obviously so close to Confederate lines. Only one soldier is left at Fort Mackinac. He was the ordnance officer, or the ordnance sergeant, and his name was William Marshall. And he'd been here since 1848, and he served all the way until 1884. He was the longest-serving soldier at Fort Mackinac. And during the Civil War, he was the lone soldier here from 61 until regular soldiers came back, not until 67. But in 1862, the fort was used for a brief period as a military prison. Andrew Johnson, who later became vice president, was the military governor of Tennessee. And in 1862, he arrested 3 Confederate civilians. They were very wealthy plantation owners who were raising funds and troops in support of the Confederacy. And in order to diminish their support and their influence, he had them arrested as political prisoners, sent them to Detroit. They tried to figure out, where are we going to incarcerate these guys? And they figured, well, we'll send them to Mackinaw. That's a long way from anywhere. So they raised a company of soldiers in Detroit called the Stanton Guard, named in honor of the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. There was a company of about 60 men, and they sent them north. And for the summer of 1862, they were incarcerated in Fort Mackinac. And it really was not too bad a duty for either the soldiers or the prisoners. They had a lot of freedom to walk around the fort. They could even go to the town under the watchful eye of a guard. And it was nice here in the summer, like it still is today. But then the fall winds began to blow, and both the soldiers and the Confederates decided they didn't want to spend the winter here. So 2 of the 3 Confederates pledged allegiance to the United States. The third one was reincarcerated in Johnson's prison down near Sandusky, Ohio. And the company was sent back to Detroit. The fort was once again abandoned and remained silent, except for the one ordnance sergeant who was here for the rest of the war.
Let me turn to how you did your research for the book. You explained how you collected the images, but do you start with all the stories and sort of do searches based on those, or how did you collect all that?
Really, I started with the images, Chris, because that's what I was going to write about. So once I collected the images, then I began to do the research both for my own files. We have a very extensive library that is focused on the military history and the other history of the Straits of Mackinac. We started in our own collection, and then I worked through other repositories, worked through online sources, and there's fairly short biographies of each soldier with each of the images, and just proceeded that way. Again, focusing in my these lengthy captions specifically on their service at Fort Mackinac.
So what part of the research did you find most enjoyable?
Finding a new image. It was thrilling. Just thrilling. We knew about the image. I mentioned Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDowell, the British officer from Stranraer, Scotland, and we knew that there was an image there. I'd seen it online, and so I thinking I'd use high tech, I emailed the small museum in Stranraer twice, got no response, and so I wrote a letter. And it was the letter that they finally responded and said, well, we'd be glad to share a copy and give you permission to use it. And I was thrilled. Got a great image of the oil portrait, and to find those images of soldiers that nobody at Fort Mackinac had seen in forever, that was really quite thrilling. And anytime we could find a new image, that was a thrill.
Mm-hmm. So how, considering all the individuals who've gone through Fort Mackinac, it's still, I guess I'm still trying to figure out, there could be someone that you didn't even think to search for and then turns out to be connected to Fort Mackinac. Did you have anything like that, stumble upon?
Not so much, because in the last 20 years or so, we've done made a very extensive effort to collect the names of as many soldiers who served at Fort Mackinac as possible. And we did this by acquiring the muster rolls, which are almost all the muster rolls are available throughout the American period. We don't have many from the British period, but we have, I think, 10 flat case drawers full of muster rolls naming just about every single American officer, or every American soldier that served here, and we have some of the list of British soldiers, and we do know the names of all the officers that served here as well. So there was no real surprise in terms of finding people. Once I did the research into some of their lives, I found some interesting facts, like the fact that Lieutenant Phelps went on to run for the presidency, that Surgeon Hammond went on to become the Surgeon General of the U.S., the Union Army during the Civil War, and that was fun too, to find out that some of these guys who served at Fort Mackinac as lesser-known soldiers became fairly prominent in their later lives.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned some of the surprises already, but was there anything that stood out as the most surprising thing you found in your research?
I can't say that there was any one most surprising thing. There were just a lot of little light bulbs that went off and fun facts, and again, that was kind of the purpose of the book, was to share this with the public. These little stories, and this is just one post. It wasn't a particularly important post in most of the U.S. history, but it was a post in the Upper Great Lakes that had some significance, especially in the early years. And I think that this study provides insight into this post that probably is similar to how other posts throughout the country, how the men who the men were and how they served there.
Mm-hmm. Well, sometimes, a lot of times in military history, people like to focus on wars and battles, but I find it interesting to look at, peacetime, garrison, kind of stuff. How did the military affect society around them, local areas, and how were they in turn affected by it? And
I completely agree with you, and I find that the most fascinating thing. So from the time I was a tour guide at the fort, I always had an interest much more in the human life of Fort Mackinac. And this little fort was home to 4,000 soldiers. They lived on this island. They worked here. They paraded here. They drilled here. They fell in love here. They got sick here. They died here. They're buried here. They were court-martialed here. They ate here. They slept here. They played baseball here. It's really quite fascinating to begin to look at the human history, which is significantly more interesting to me, and I think to most people, than the military architecture, which I like, and the battles, which I like. Mm-hmm. But when you get into the human history, it really makes the fort come alive as a place, as a home, as a part of the Mackinac community. And as that Mackinac community evolved from the fur trade to the fishing industry to a tourism destination, the soldiers are here the whole time, and so their role as a part of the community changes. And as you suggested, not only do they impact the community, but the community impacts them. And so to be a soldier here in the early 18th century was not very desirable. It was very cold, very isolated, very lonely. To be a soldier here in the 1880s he's in the desert, and he's got tarantulas and rattlesnakes, and he comes to northern Michigan, and it's a beautiful summer resort and a lovely fort on a hill with a beautiful view over the Straits of Mackinaw, and he said, I think I can stand 4 years of this very well. So its role changed, and again, the impact on the island as a place to live was much different for later soldiers than the earlier soldiers.
Mm-hmm. Was there anything that was particularly difficult to find or research that just took a little more effort than other things that you were working on in the book?
I think always the finding of the images, and then, frankly, getting the permissions to use those images is a very long and tedious process, because you now work with multiple repositories, libraries, museums, places in this country, in Scotland, in England, in Ireland, to get some of these images, and in Canada, and that just took time. But that's the part of the process that historians and authors go through in order to get something published.
Mm-hmm. Did you come across any images that you used in the book that had elements, maybe something in the uniform or something in the background or whatever that made you say, that's kind of odd. I'm curious what this is.
Yeah, several years ago, I made contact with the descendants of an officer who was here. His name was Lieutenant Edward Barton Pratt.
Mm-hmm.
He was here in the 1880s. His dad was the commanding officer of the fort prior to the Civil War, and his maternal grandfather was a commanding officer here in the 1830s. So he's a third-generation soldier here. They all lived in the same building, and I made contact with his granddaughter, and she was an elderly lady, and she was so thrilled because when I got on the phone to talk to her, she said, that was my grandfather's favorite post. That began a long series of correspondence and conversations that eventually led to her donating to us his scrapbook of photographs, and we're about to publish that as another book. But in that scrapbook are wonderful images that, again, give insight into soldier life. For example, Pratt was an avid baseball player, and he helped to form the first Fort Mackinac baseball team.
Yeah.
They had a baseball team in the 1880s. He was the captain of the team. He provided the money for some of their uniforms, and they played on the field behind the fort where we still play baseball today. And there's a photograph from that album of the soldiers on the field playing baseball. That's very rare, and it's just a wonderful confirmation of some of the newspaper articles I had read about the soldiers playing baseball. Now, here's a photograph of them on the field, again, where we still play baseball today, and that was thrilling. In that same photo album, there is a photograph of the interior of his quarters, which shows how an officer lived, but even more importantly, I think, a photograph of the interior of the soldiers' barracks. And so it shows the standard soldier bunks, their chests, how they mounted their muskets, the type of heaters that they had in there. It has tables. It has men playing cards at the table. Just the human information about soldiers living at the fort in that photograph is it's really exciting when you find something like that.
Oh yeah, I love that sort of stuff. That slice of military life.
And those images are in the book as well. They're not just portraits of soldiers. We have these images of the baseball, of the interiors of the house, of the quarters, and some of the other images of the fort at that time as well.
Okay, nice. So it's not just portraits then, it is, you look at the structure itself then in these.
There's images of the structures, there's maps showing the evolution of the fort, there are images of soldiers as groups inside and around the fort as well. So it's not just portraits, no, it's much more comprehensive than that.
Okay. Was there anything you discovered, well, it sounds like, I was going to ask anything that emotionally moved you. It seems like this discovery of the scrapbook was one thing. Yeah,
that was pretty exciting. And then, over the years, as I've done research on specific officers, as we've done new exhibits, we kind of do our exhibits in some of the period settings, and we focus them on the life of an officer. I did some work on an officer named Calvin Duval Coles. He served at Fort Mackinac off and on in the 1880s. He came here and left and then came back again. He lived here with his wife and several children, two of whom died while they were here as infants. And that was very moving to read his letters home to his father about the death of his children, who are still buried here in the Post Cemetery on the island. And so I did a lot of research on him. And when I was in Washington several years ago, I went out to Arlington and I visited his grave. And that was very moving because I spent months reading about this guy, reading his letters, learning about his family. And so it was very moving to go and be at his final burial place in Arlington, which of course is such a substantial and important American site, and subsequently found out that I'm related to him. My 7th grade grandfather married a Coles who was related to his 5th grade grandmother. We're 6 cousins 3 times removed. That's the technical connection, but it was just kind of moving to find out that after I've been studying this guy for all this time, I'm actually related to him, and so that was pretty cool as well.
Okay. So, apart from adding to the historical knowledge of Fort Mackinac, what else do you hope the book will do for readers?
Well, I hope it gets to this thing that I find so interesting, and that is to reveal Fort Mackinac as a place where real people lived. And through the images, they can see the people, and through the biographies, they can read about the human activities here, whether I talk about a lot of soldiers who met women here and got married, and their families are still now today. I talk about soldiers who died here. I talk about soldiers who had children here. I talk about, a variety of soldiers who then went on to have famous careers elsewhere. But the whole point is that this fort is a place where real people lived, and I think through the stories and through the images that I hope that comes alive for my readers.
So you mentioned some of the difficulties in finishing the book, with getting rights to some of these images. Were there any other difficulties in finishing or publishing the book?
Not really. Mackinaw State Historic Parks, our organization, has been publishing books for a long time, but in the last few years, on some major projects, we have cooperated. We published cooperatively with Michigan State University Press, and that's really been a wonderful relationship. They have an outstanding and very prestigious press. They have a great staff who did a wonderful job editing the book and laid it out beautifully and took the responsibility for printing it. So it was a wonderful relationship. So I would say that the publishing of it, once it was all together, was a really a joyful process working with Michigan State University Press. Great people to work with.
So now, since you and the people you work with are pretty much the experts on this, what's the process? How does an editor get a hold of the book, and what do they question, when they're trying to make it better with whatever? What's the interplay there?
I would say it was mostly copy editing, wanting to make sure that there was consistency in the way that things were done in terms of punctuation, in terms of, did we capitalize, lieutenant and captain, did we not capitalize, and just making that consistent. It was mostly copy editing, but it was really well done, and certainly every author should be edited, just so that somebody with another set of eyes can perfect the final appearance of the text. And then again, they did the layout. Michigan State University had a layout person who did the layout, and that I think was really well done in terms of presenting the information and the images.
Okay. What's your next writing project?
I don't know. I've been at this for a long time. I'm 65 years old, and I don't know. I have some other ideas, but I'm not. I don't have anything concrete in my mind. I'd like to do some shorter things, probably first, some vignettes size things. But we have other members of our staff who are excellent historians, and as a state agency and as a museum, we're pretty active in getting our research into publication form so that it can be shared with the public. So we keep moving forward, and as I said before, one of the things we're working on right now is publishing a book that talks about that Pratt album, of military images that were collected by Lieutenant Edward Pratt, who served here, both his images before and after he was at the fort. So that's next, and our staff keeps working on other projects as well.
So people can find the book on Amazon and I guess also the press's site, but is there anywhere people can find your writings or work by the parks?
You bet. Again, for this book, for the Soldiers of Fort Mackinac, I would recommend the MSU site or Amazon. But also all of our other books, and we've published 100 titles over the years, everything from studies about the fur trade to social history, military history, transportation history, even fudge history, because Mackinac Island is known for making fudge during its tourism time. All those can be found on our website, which is Mackinaw Parks, all one word, Mackinaw spelled MACKINAC Parks.com, all one word, MackinawParks.com. And
just for readers, or just for listeners who aren't familiar with the spelling and pronunciation, it's spelled with an AC but pronounced AW, right?
That's correct.
And that comes from, and what's the reason for that again?
It goes back to the Native American name for this island in this area. It's Mackinaw, meaning land of the great turtle, or place of the great turtle, because they thought the island looked like a large turtle rising out of the water. Over the French came and spelled that out, and as is sometimes the case in French, if you have a consonant at the end preceded by a vowel, the consonant is silent. So it's St. Louis, it's not St. Louis, it's Mackinaw, not Mackinac. That was shortened over time just simply to become Mackinaw. Mostly it's spelled AC. There are a few places like Mackinaw City on the mainland and a few other places that have a phonetic spelling of AW, but the island and the fort are AC, Mackinaw.
Okay. So that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts?
No, it was a great interview. I enjoyed talking about it. Got me all excited about the book again.
Good. All right. Well, thank you.
All right. My pleasure.
Thank you for listening. One of the best ways to provide feedback on this podcast is to rate it on iTunes. Please let me know if you liked it, or give me a poor rating if you didn't like this podcast, and I can use that feedback to hopefully get better. Otherwise, please follow me on Instagram at Chris Alvarez War Scholar, on YouTube under War Scholar 1945, on Twitter at War Scholar, on Facebook under War Scholar, and you can find more information on my website, warscholar.org. Please remember, my name Chris does not have an H, so it's CRISALVAREZ. Thank you, and I hope you continue to enjoy this podcast.